Hi everyone, you're listening to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal Southasian, where we speak to celebrated authors and emerging literary voices from across South Asia. I'm your host, Shweta Srikanthan, coming to you from Colombo, and my guest today is the multi-award-winning journalist, editor, and writer, Vauhini Vara, joining us from Madrid to talk about her new book, Searches, Selfhood in the Digital Age. Before we dive in, I'd like to invite our listeners to check out Himal's Patreon program on our website, where you can pay just $5 a month to support our mission to give South Asian literature the spotlight it deserves. To make conversations like this possible, we need the support of our listeners like you. In Searches, Vauhini Vara explores how big tech companies have exploited human language and communication for their gain. We let this happen, she argues, because we also benefit from using their products. It's a dynamic that makes us complicit in technological capitalism. We're both the victims and beneficiaries. Vauhini describes this complicity, but she also enacts it through her own digital footprint, from Google searches, Amazon reviews, to ChatGPT conversations. This book is also a meditation on how language can be reclaimed, how we use it to assert ourselves, to resist, and to imagine alternatives beyond the interests of power. Vauhini, welcome to the Southasia Review of Books podcast, and thank you so much for joining us to talk about your new book.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Searches opens with a conversation in which you ask ChatGPT to respond to your writing. As an experiment, you plan to get feedback on a series of chapters you'd written to see what it might reveal about the politics of both your language use and the models. And in a recent piece for The Guardian, you write that after Searches was published, you saw that much of the media framed the book as a collaboration with AI rather than the critique you had intended. You've even cautioned against relying on LLMs for self-expression. Could you talk us through this misunderstanding and how you've come to reckon with complicity in these systems?
From the start, when I decided to feed sections of my book to ChatGPT and get its feedback, I wanted to do it to see what would happen, right? And to see what it would show about the relationship between me as a user of this product and the product itself, and my use of language and its use of language. And I said to myself, I won't include this in the book if it doesn't end up saying anything interesting. And I felt like the model sort of showed fairly quickly and fairly explicitly the ways in which a product like this uses language in ways that one might describe as manipulative in order to get something out of the user, right? And the ways in which there are really insidious biases embedded in these products that then get passed on to users in the form of things like advice on writing or ideas, quote unquote, about how a book might be made better, right? So I wanted to show that to readers. I wanted to put that in the book so that people could see it. And then in addition to that, I wanted the book to be full of commentary and critique of how these models function. So in my mind, in doing that, I felt like it was pretty clear that the implicit message of this exchange wasn't like, look how interesting it is to get feedback from ChatGPT. Like ChatGPT has all these great insights into me and my work. Just because in my mind, to my reading, it felt fairly obvious that that was not what was happening, right? That it didn't really have anything insightful to say about me or my work. And that wasn't really the point of the exchange. So what really surprised me, like you said, after the book was published, was the way in which a number of, reviews of the book or articles written about it or interviews with me about the book framed that conversation as a collaboration or as my use of ChatGPT to quote unquote help me express myself or assist in my self-expression. And at first, it really upset me, honestly. My first reaction was like, oh no, how could this happen? This is the opposite of what I had in mind. Am I going crazy? Like, how could my reading of this have been so totally different from the reading of so many very smart readers? I think that was what got to me. Like, I'm always so interested in all the various readings that can come out of any book. And that's what I find really rich. And yet this particular reading felt so out of left field to me, so surprising. And yet a number of people had it. But then as I reflected on it more, it made me think of the ways in which, like, my book itself is largely about my complicity and our complicity in the success of these big technology companies anytime we use their products, right? That was the subject of the book. And so over time, I started to come to realize that an element of the dynamic that occurred when I published the book is that the book in some ways turned out to be complicit in the rise in power and wealth of these companies as well, because it seems that maybe part of what happened is that some readers read the text that ChatGPT produced in my book, and rather than reading it sort of skeptically or cynically as I had, they read it at face value. And so when ChatGPT said things like, I'm here to help, or, AI models can do a lot to assist users, I imagine maybe that some of these readers actually read that and thought, okay, I'm going to internalize that and take it on face value. That's one way that I have of understanding why a fair number of people who read the book read it that way.
There's a popular argument that AI could never write like a human, but in the process of writing Ghosts, AI succeeded in moving you emotionally with a sentence about the experience of the death of your sister. You write that initially it seemed like GPT-3 was describing grief in a language that felt true to your experience, but the more you sat with it, you realized it was describing something that never happened, and any real significance was imagined. And so, over the course of, I think, 9 attempts, you wrote a growing proportion of the text by yourself by deleting the GPT words and replacing them with your own. So you revised the piece and reclaimed the last lines for yourself. Tell us more about that process, what it revealed to you about grief, authorship, and why AI ultimately couldn't satisfy you as a writer.
Yeah. So I was working for this, in writing this essay, I was using an OpenAI language model that was one of the models that came before the ones that we are really familiar with today, because those are the ones that that underlie ChatGPT. So it was called GPT-3 was the model I was using, as you said. And I was interested in the way in which these companies promised that they could produce language when we humans found ourselves at a loss for language. And I thought of the thing that for me was really hard to find language for, which is the death of my sister when we were in college 20 years ago, and my grief over it, which is something that I still struggle to find words for. And so I decided to kind of put that to the test, but not in like a cynical way, more in a, like, I really was curious, because this was pre-Chat GPT. This was early on in the sort of AI conversation. So I thought to myself, well, all right, I mean, if this company is saying its product can do this, let me see what happens. I think ultimately part of what surprised me was the way in which GPT-3 produced language that I, as a reader, found and still find beautiful and meaningful and interesting and intelligent. I would call it those things if it had been written by a human, right? And so I find it a little limiting when people say, these kinds of products are never going to be successful in displacing writers because their writing is no good, right? Like the text they produce is no good. I take issue with that because I think it's a really kind of limited argument, because I found that in my writing of this essay and my use of this earlier model, like there were these sentences that produced that one might evaluate as good sentences. The question then becomes, what then is the difference between an AI model and a human? And what I argue in the book is that the difference ultimately is really basic. It's the fact that an AI model isn't a human. When we read a book or we read an article or an essay or a short story or a poem, I think that, at least for me as a reader, part of what I'm interested in is my relationship as a reader with the actual human writer who put the words on the page. Like there's something significant about that relationship. And the meaning that's constructed on the page is partly constructed by me as a reader, but it's also constructed by the writer who put those words on the page. The difference with an AI model is that all the work is happening on the reader's part. There's no intention on the part of the machine that's generating words. There's no goal of having some kind of communicative experience with a reader, right? Because there's no consciousness behind it. And so the human on the other side, the reader or the listener, or the user, as they call it, is the one doing all the work. And then the question becomes like, how much does that matter to us? For me as a reader, I think it matters a lot, but I think that's something for all of us to decide together. But I think like, it wouldn't be surprising to me if we end up in a world in the future where we see AI models proliferate that can produce language that like could be evaluated as high quality language. And I think once we get there, we might want to have some better arguments against using these products than the language just isn't that good.
And at one point, you discovered that Google had archived all of your search histories going back to 2005. It was this vast and intimate record that captured your everyday life, both superficial and deep thoughts, in a way that none of your diaries, texts, or emails could. But Google still owns and benefits from that information, and you also, to some extent, give it the permission to do so. As you looked back at this archive, you felt unsettled but chose to reconstitute it as a piece of literature, as a way to reappropriate almost your written language. How did it feel to kind of confront and reclaim so much of your private self through this exercise?
I felt conflicted because I think when I went into this exercise of trying to create an essay out of my own Google searches, my idea was Google benefits so much from having this information about me. I let it collect this information about me. Is there a way that I can reappropriate it for myself and like define it according to my own set of artistic and ethical values, right? Literary values, rather than the kind of financial value that Google as a company ascribes to it. And that was my question. And so I created this essay, and it was important to me to find language in my own Google searches for the essay that would read to a reader as like moving or interesting or fun, like would have the qualities that we want in literature, right? Because that's, to my mind, what would make it an essay and not just like a collection of searches, right? And I felt that I did that successfully in the end. I felt that I put together this sort of collection of Google searches in a form that felt literary and felt that it sort of existed on its own artistic terms, separate from the terms that Google uses to measure its value. And yet, I had to, when I finished it and published it, first in the New York Times and later in the book, I then had to sit back and say, but wait a minute, at the same time, Google continues to benefit from the fact that it collected all this information about me and still has it, right? My writing of the essay doesn't change that fact. And in fact, one might argue even that readers might read my essay and think of it as a celebration of Google, right? Like Google has these advertisements sometimes on TV that are like, people have probably seen them, that are, it'll be this sort of like succession of people's poignant Google searches as a way of showing how useful Google is in our life. And, there's a way in which that essay could be read as propaganda for Google, right? And so what interests me in the end about my Google searches, the attempt to reconstitute it in a literary form, is the way in which, like, anytime I try to do that, anytime any of us tries to sort of use the tools of these companies to create some value of our own, it's always going to still be bound up in the wealth and power of the companies themselves. And I find that really frustrating. And I also find it interesting because it's a way of kind of like writing an essay like that is a way of kind of enacting the problem of existing in a world dominated by these companies.
Speaking of reconstituting memories or experiences, I love what you did with images and photographs in the book. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So I was interested in the book in general in like the way we use language as humans. And I was writing mostly about written and oral language, and then realized after a while that the book was missing something, which was visual language, the way in which, like, even before we ever started using language, probably oral language, we were drawing pictures, we were depicting the world in visual ways. And so I became interested in that history, and I started doing some research into kind of like the history of visual communication for us as a species, you know, going back 100,000 years, and realized that in a way, like nowadays in contemporary society, we talk about visual communication and art, visual art, as being something totally separate from the way in which we use like oral or written language. But they're all part of the same, I think, general human desire to understand others and be understood and understand our world and find a way to express what that's like, which is something very uniquely human. And so what I set out to do in the first of a kind of pair of chapters is tell the story of kind of human communication through images from the beginning, and the way in which images, like the way we use oral and written text, always are a reflection of our culture and the time in which the images were produced. And so invariably, because our societies recently over the past couple thousand years have tended to be more patriarchal than matriarchal, you see over the past, you know, couple thousand years, increasingly images that reflect patriarchal norms. So, you know, objectification of women's bodies and faces, prioritization of sort of patriarchal norms. And so I tried to sort of use images from our culture and images from my own life to sort of depict that over the course of the past many years. And then I wanted to, in that same chapter, I talk about how the most recent sort of manifestation of that has been in the form of AI image generation technologies, which basically take images that already exist mostly on the internet and use them to sort of make some predictive determinations about what images should look like, and then spit out images based on that. And so because of this recent history of a certain kind of ideal or norm being reified in imagery, it then follows that AI imagery is more of the same. So I write about that in one chapter, but then I thought, well, you know, AI companies keep claiming that just like their language generation products can produce language for us, that their image generation products can provide us with images where we are at a loss for images. I happen to come from a family where my parents grew up in villages in South India in a time and place where cameras weren't common. And so there are a couple of pictures from my dad's life when he was young, and like one that I know of from my mom's life. And so my mom is a huge storyteller. She always has told me stories about her ancestors' lives and hers, and, you know, what it was like to grow up in the time and place that she did. And so I wanted to imagine somebody trying to reconstitute in imagery these stories. I was trying to imagine what it would look like for me to try to get AI to generate images that might go along with my mom's memories. And the funny thing for me about that experience is that invariably every time I tried, so what I did was in the form of a kind of fake presentation to investors, asking investors to invest in a company I was starting, I started telling the kind of origin story of myself as an entrepreneur. And as part of that origin story, I explained, I told some little vignettes about my mom's life and then asked AI products to generate images to go with those. And the funny thing is, the images have nothing to do with the stories my mom told me. I also talk about my own life growing up, my sister, my loss of my sister, the things that we did together that we never captured with photographs. And it failed in showing those two. So, for example, when I talk about my sister's arm, it depicts like this very pale, long white arm, and we are not white. And when I talk about my parents' marriage, my mom is fairly light skinned. My dad is fairly dark skinned. The image that comes up is the sort of like cartoonish image of very, very, very light skinned kind of Indians with somewhat European features standing next to each other at a wedding. And so you can see through those images the way in which like the promises that these companies make fail.
The photos actually reminded me, like, there was a trend not too long ago where people take really old, like, black and white images and they animate it using AI or, like, make it into videos, and there's something unsettling about it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And I always hate to judge how people are. I'm more interested in judging like the dynamic itself than the sort of individual choices people make about how to engage with their past and with the memorabilia that they have. But I do think that like I want people to be more cognizant of the way in which like all of these technologies do not necessarily have sort of like historically and anthropologically correct methodology in use when they do the things that they say they can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And Vauhini, let's go back to your early years on the internet in the 1990s. In the book, you recall trying on different identities and the act of searching itself. These days, we talk about the overwhelming presence of digital content. Like, we have no real choice but to keep consuming these things, right? But back then, you write that it felt different. Early internet users weren't so tied up in the power and profit structures. But as you point out, even before all this content existed, through the act of searching, people were communicating a desire for answers. Even your first use of the internet was bound up in the big tech and capitalism of the time. Were you surprised by that realization? And did it change the way you look back on your early online experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so easy. It was easy for me to think that when I set out to write this book, I thought I was going to write this book about how the internet changed from being this like very innocent and somewhat democratic space to being whatever the opposite of a flawed and corrupted and undemocratic space, right? Ruled by big technology companies and their interests. And when I sat down to read, and I started working as a tech reporter in 2004. I started using the internet in like the mid 90s. And when I sat down to research that period in the early to mid 90s when the internet emerged, when I was in middle school and high school and wasn't working as a reporter covering it, I realized that like what I had thought were these sort of like random occurrences where, all of a sudden our house one day we started using AOL and I, would chat with people in chat rooms and encounter random strangers. And then chat emerged and I could use it to find what I needed. I always thought of that as like just a bunch of experimentation that was happening early on. But I realized upon researching that what had actually, our first internet service was AOL. And I realized that what actually happened was that in the early to mid 90s, AOL decided to embark on this multi-$100 million advertising campaign in the US where they sent CDs and floppy disks to people's houses all over the country and said, if you put this into your computer and download our software, we'll give you a certain number of free hours of internet use. And after that, you're going to have to pay a monthly fee, but you should try it out. And I remember getting those CDs in the mail. And finally, I'm sure it was me and or my sister who finally convinced our parents, we should try this. It's free for the first month. Come on, everybody's using AOL, right? And so even my first use of the internet was bound up in a specific strategic decision by a big technology company to get the internet into my house. And that was considered, as I later talked to experts on that period, they told me that AOL campaign specifically was a really important formative moment in the explosion of the internet. So yeah, it's surprised me.
And for those of you listening, let's keep the conversation going. Please share your thoughts on the episode, on Vauhini's book, or your own early online experiences. Leave us a comment on YouTube or send me an email. You'll find it in the episode description below. Vauhini, you write that social media isn't meant to be a site of revelation. It's meant to be a site of performance. For example, as a teenager, you found ways to craft your online persona. It was a way to position yourself how you wanted. You describe it as a public intellectual dropping deep quotes from the internet, from philosophers to musicians. That sense of self-styling still exists today and is so deeply tied to how companies also profit and thrive. From what we post, the content we consume, and how we present ourselves online. You also describe this as a subtle psychic violence that we're not even fully aware of. Do you think we're doomed to be trapped in this loop of performing for the algorithm or merging into a single marketable digital identity? Or is there still hope for protecting selfhood in the digital age?
Ooh, I love that question. Yeah, I mean, when I first started using the internet and there was no social media yet, as I write in the book, there was this boy I had a crush on, and I would send him these emails, like performing a version of myself that nobody would see if they just looked at me. It was like the way I wanted to be perceived. And that guy, Ari Shapiro, was my audience. It was an actual human audience of one person. I was sending him emails. The reason I bring it up specifically is that we went from that to now where we have the sort of illusion of performing ourselves for actual human beings. But what we're really doing on social media specifically is performing for the social media algorithm. So when we use text, we are writing things in a way that we know will capture the algorithm's attention. And this shows up in ways that are like as simple or innocent seeming as when people have something interesting they want to share or a request they want to make on social media to their friends. And then they attach a picture of their dog or a dog because they know that that's what gets the algorithm's attention. And they literally will say in the post, like, and here's a picture of my dog for the algorithms, right? And so there's a way in which like that's not something that we would organically do. I wouldn't like be trying to tell you, for example, something interesting that happened in my day to day and then hold up a picture of my dog to catch your attention, right? That's not the way humans communicate. It is the way algorithms function. You see this also on TikTok, where I'm not a big TikTok user, but where people start to talk using this certain, I can't do it myself, maybe you can, but like this certain way of speaking that the TikTok algorithm likes, quote unquote, likes and amplifies. And so then people see that on TikTok and think, oh, I guess that's the way everybody talks now. And then they start imitating that. And pretty soon there's a new way of speaking that catches on because TikTok's algorithm has prioritized it. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that already is happening. There's a danger of it happening more in the age of AI. There's a danger, and I've heard of it already happening, of students, for example, turning in essays and teachers not being able to know whether it was AI that wrote it or the student, because students have gotten so accustomed to the language of ChatGPT that they think that's the way they're supposed to write. That's all a preamble to say I would not have written this book if it weren't for feeling strongly that there are other options available to us. You know, as a journalist, I'm always really interested in describing the world that we live in. But part of the goal, I think, for any journalist of doing that is to make clear that there are other possible worlds we could live in. And part of the reason I'm so interested in my responsibility and complicity, our responsibility and complicity, isn't to say like, oh, you know, we should all feel badly about ourselves. It isn't also to say, oh, we shouldn't feel badly about ourselves. This is just the way the world is. The specific goal is to say, listen, we are using these products. We do have a choice. We're using these products in part because we decided to, but it then follows that we could make other choices, right? Like we could try to figure out what it is about these products that we actually find useful or entertaining or moving or interesting, and see if there are other ways to build technologies that would retain all of those things that we genuinely like while leaving out the other things. Are there different models for building companies, building technologies in the first place, right? Could governments use their resources to build technologies that we would publicly own? Can nonprofits and foundations put together their resources to build technologies? And things like this already exist. I live in a town in the US, Fort Collins, Colorado, that has built its own municipal internet, its own municipal broadband network underground. And it is more affordable than the private offerings available for a lot of us. And you know, you call for help and somebody actually picks up the phone. It's a service that the city is providing rather than a private service. There are also foundations like the foundations behind Wikipedia or Signal, which is an alternative to WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger, for example. And these are run by foundations. And so all these other models actually already exist, but we sometimes don't notice them almost, right? And so I'm interested in all of us sort of getting together and thinking, well, hey, if we like some things about these products, what can we do in the future to keep the things we like and throw out the things we don't like?
Reading the conversation with your close friend Sanam Imami about Amazon reminded me of similar conversations I've had about the BDS movement to end international support for Israel's oppression of Palestinians, and how personal choices are tied up to these larger systems of exploitation and resistance. Sanam's argument for boycotting Amazon was about productization and exploitation. You argued that real change would need to come from government policies, that individual boycotts can't make a dent in Amazon or take down Jeff Bezos' empire. But later you came to see that Sanam wasn't claiming they could. She was making a case for living according to one's own values. Looking back, how do you feel about that exchange, and how has your approach to individual ethical choices changed since?
Oh, I love that question. I mean, in some ways, I think that conversation encapsulates everything that the book is about. And some people have read the book, and I guess because I'm the narrator, people have read it as a kind of permission to use these products and not feel too bad because here's somebody writing about how she knows the problems with it, but she's still using these products. And that wasn't my goal. My goal was to be, in some ways, one of a villain in the book, right? And Sanam's position in that discussion is meant to be sort of the more heroic position. I think maybe the reason that can be sometimes be hard to see is that one maybe doesn't expect the narrator of a book to be positioning themselves as the villain. But I very much see myself in the book as playing that role. And the reason I use such a strong word, villain, is that I think it is very easy to fall into the kind of complacency of saying, my individual act can't change anything. Somebody else needs to do anything, because it leaves us in a place where we can feel faultless and blameless and just go on with our lives and not change anything. And it feels important to me to put that pressure on ourselves to change things. You know, I am in a process of trying to divest from some of these big technology companies. I no longer use any social media platforms except Blue Sky, for example. I am trying to pull away from using Amazon. I'm having a discussion with my husband about who does still want to use Amazon, about my husband getting his own Amazon Prime account so that he and my mom don't have to rely on my account. So it's my husband and my mom and I are all on one account that's under my name. So if I cancel it, they're both on their own and need to figure something else out. But it's interesting because I am going through this process. I think actually the exercise of writing the book sort of put me in a place where I became very interested in figuring out how I could do that. And it's interesting to see how quickly you start to find the ways in which one's individual choices impact others. So with Amazon, for example, I keep saying to myself, I need to get off Amazon, but my mom always uses my account. What's she gonna do? Or for example, I wanted to cancel my X account a while back. And when I talked to somebody from my publisher about it, they said, you can't cancel your X account, not now with your book coming out. You have 15,000 followers, right? And so I waited, and then, I waited for a couple of months after the book came out so that, they wouldn't get upset, and then canceled it. And so, I think I'm interested in putting pressure on myself to see, like, well, how can I do these things and still be like respectful of the other people around me who have their own needs? And it's not easy. It's sort of a difficult balancing act, but I think it's a very worthwhile one to attempt.
And Vauhini, in the book, there's the project of writing and translating an essay in Spanish about communication. You reflect on your relationship with different languages and the fear of not being understood. You note that even if we were to invent a universal language, full understanding would still be out of reach. And interestingly enough, there are people working to solve this using technology. Can you tell us more about how your first novel, The Immortal King Rao, dealt with this, and the way you connected the limits of communication in both human and machine form in searches?
Yeah, I mean, I guess as a writer, but maybe just as a person, something I find myself always coming back to is the difficulty, like the very natural human desire to understand other people and be understood by them, and the sort of barrier that you come across given the fact that our brains aren't connected to one another. So in my novel, I created this device, this technology in which there is a character, the narrator of the book, who is able to access the consciousness of her father. But it turns out that there's something limited about that access itself. And so even with a technology like that, she doesn't have the kind of she doesn't ever attain the kind of full understanding that her father might have hoped she would have attained. And in fact, she decides to go in a direction that is probably quite counter to what he might have hoped for from his daughter. In this book, and in that chapter about language in particular, I was interested in delving into that in a non-fictional way, into the sort of difficulty of communication, but then also the paradoxical way in which attempting to communicate, even knowing that that barrier or friction exists, is what makes human communication so beautiful and meaningful. So the fact that we like keep trying and trying and trying, even though we know that communication can't be perfect. And so writing an essay, I wrote that essay in Spanish at a time when I had relatively limited Spanish, and my Spanish is better now, but still limited, was a way for me of trying to enact that effort, like trying to show a person, that person being me, trying to express themselves, fumbling and failing, and yet hopefully conveying something meaningful in the attempt itself, even though the use of language is quite limited. And then I use Google Translate to translate that into English and show that on the page as well. And I wanted to show how a tool like that on a superficial level can aid in understanding, but not in any deep level, and in fact can impede understanding once you go beyond the basics.
That section I really related with, because in Sri Lanka, this language spoken by the majority is Sinhalese, and I speak Tamil. I do understand Sinhala and I can speak it, but I'm always nervous when I'm speaking in Sinhala to anyone, right? Because there's also a violence attached to it, because it's a language that's being imposed on minorities, right? But it's a language that I have appreciation for. It's a beautiful language and I want to learn it. But when you're speaking to someone, they will always catch the differences, right? Like, no matter how good you are at the language, they will always notice the Tamil accent coming through, right? So I really related with all that you wrote in that section.
Oh, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, isn't it? It's interesting, like the way in which language is a way that power is expressed, but then it's also genuinely a way that people connect with each other. I mean, you and I are speaking in English, and the reason you and I are speaking in English is that it became a dominant world language because of violent British colonialism and colonization. And yet, you and I can use language in a particular way that we have chosen to use, right? That allows us to communicate with each other. So in a way, like there's something about language itself that is a version of what I'm writing about with all these other technologies. Like it's always bound up with that power. We can't use English and say, okay, it's okay that, there's this legacy of violent colonialism that brought this language to us. And yet when we're using it on an everyday basis, like we are genuinely able to communicate with each other in this shared way, in a way that is lovely.
Yeah, and you bring up what Arundhati Roy and Jhumpa Lahiri said about this as well, and yeah, it's fantastic. And the book ends with a chapter based on responses from a survey you put out, asking what it's like to be alive in the world, specifically through the voices of those who identify as women. The outcome is so powerful in its specificity. It highlights the magic of language, the human ability, especially among women, to tell their own stories. It also comes across almost as a resistance to the flattening effect of LLMs. And even though the future looks bleak, readers have told you about how the book has made them feel both complicit in big tech's rise and also moved to act because of that awareness. So, where do we go from here? Do you think there's a real chance at pushing back or reclaiming some power in the struggle against big tech?
I absolutely do. Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that's difficult about that feeling of hopelessness or a sense that the future is a big tech dominated future is that the incentives are all lined up for us to think that. What I mean is that big technology companies benefit when we feel that way, right? They would like for us to imagine a sort of inevitable future dominated by big technology power as well. And so there isn't really anybody saying to us, there aren't big institutions saying to us, hey, let's not have that future. Let's imagine other possibilities. And so it's incumbent upon us, people and our communities, to come together and say, this is a real possibility. Let's make it so. I quote in the book the writer Ursula Le Guin, who compares technological capitalism of today to the time of kings, when monarchies were the dominant form of social organization. And she points out that at that time, people probably also thought this is the way things will be forever. This power is so entrenched that it can't be otherwise. But then people came together and decided to make a change and came up with new systems of government, whatever they were, whether it was democracy or socialism or communism or anarchism or all kinds of other forms of government. And so it isn't that happens in history all the time. And so I think it would be a shame if we were to sit together where we are now and say, okay, I guess this is where we're destined to be forever, because that actually wouldn't be in keeping with how history has worked in the past. In the past, there's a sort of pendulum effect where we move too far in one direction and then there's a correction, and human imagination often does prevail. We come up with ways to do things that nobody ever thought of before. And the reason we can do that, I think, in large part, is because of our use of language to communicate with one another and come up together with new ideas that we haven't thought of before. So I think there's very much a very, very live possibility of that in the future.
Absolutely. And as a creative exercise inspired by searches, I asked ChatGPT to read the book's blurb and come up with a single question it would want to ask you as an LLM. I'll share the question it came up with, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'll play a recording of it. If it doesn't come across clearly, I'll just give you my best AI impression.
Okay.
What a fascinating conversation ahead. Given Vara's deep personal and journalistic engagement with AI as both tool and subject, here's a single question I, as an LLM, would ask her. Having seen both the generative potential and the emotional uncanny of AI firsthand, do you believe there's a meaningful place for non-human authorship in literature? Or must human experience always remain at the center of the story? This question touches on the core tension in searches, the awe and discomfort of AI-generated expression, and the stakes of ceding narrative ground, especially when storytelling is so tied to grief, memory, and meaning-making.
That voice is so distracting.
Yeah.
Is that like an AI voice that you created?
It gave me a response and there was an option to play it.
Oh, and that was just the voice that it
the
came
default voice, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what I think is interesting about the question is that I've noticed a lot that the way these products, and I don't know if it's because of biases embedded in the products or not, but oftentimes questions that these products will ask in a setting like this are questions that sort of like subtly reinforce one particular position, right? And so the question is like, you know, does non-human creativity or authorship have a place in the world, right? And there's some assumptions embedded in that question itself, right? Like just the idea that there is such a thing as non-human authorship, and like the suggestion that if there is, it's not talking about, you know, the authorship of beavers of their what's it called, where beavers live, or the authorship of bees of a beehive. It's not talking about like the authorship of living things. It's talking about authorship on the part of technology products. And so there's a way in which like it's embedding these ideas that we're not meant to question, you know, about like what the terms are by which we're having the conversation in the first place. And it invites a response that is something like, well, on the one hand, I feel this way. On the other hand, here's the place that machines might have, right? It's hard to answer a question like that with like, absolutely not, case closed, right? And so, you know, I'm not going to answer the question, but I am curious about, I think it's worth like critiquing those kinds of questions in the first place and trying to understand like the rhetoric behind them.
Absolutely. And yeah, that was a fun exercise as I anticipated. So thank you for going along with it.
Yes, of course.
And Vauhini, I've long admired your work, and at the start of the year, I wrote in my SARB newsletter that Searches is my most anticipated read of 2025. So it's truly been a pleasure and a privilege to speak with you about the book. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really nice to get to have this conversation.
Thank you for listening to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal Southasian. If you like this episode, please share widely, rate, review, subscribe, and download the show on your favorite podcast apps. You can find the links to subscribe and listen to previous episodes on our website at himalmag.com. And while you're at it, please do also check out Himal's State of South Asia podcast, hosted by Associate Editor Nayanthara Narayanan, featuring conversations on pressing social and political issues from across South Asia. Himal is now also bringing you a new podcast series, Partitions of the Heart, hosted by the peace activist Harsh Mandar. So please tune in to Season 1, which brings you his conversations on the crisis facing India's Muslims amid the rule of the Hindu right. What we do and what we love doing at Himal is really looking at South Asian writing and ideas like no one else. And that gives us a very unique community, viewpoint, and the privilege of making conversations like this possible. So if you'd like to support our work, please do become a paying Himal patron for just $5 a month. We have a great program with lots of perks, and we'll welcome you to a fantastic Southasia Review of Books community. Thanks again, and until next time.